Hansel and Gretel, the sweetest adventure. Once upon a time, in a valley near a big forest, there was a small cottage. In this cottage lived a woodcutter and his two children, a little boy named Hansel and his sister, Gretel. The woodcutter was very poor, and finding work was hard. Sometimes he didn't earn enough money to buy food, so Hansel and Gretel often went to bed hungry. Even though times were tough, Hansel and Gretel stayed cheerful. They never complained because they knew how much their father loved them and how hard he worked, even if he couldn't always bring home much. One evening, after Hansel and Gretel had gone to bed, the woodcutter sat by the fire, talking to his wife. She was their stepmother, and unfortunately, she wasn't very kind to the children. "Oh, dear wife," the woodcutter said sadly, "I can barely take care of you and myself, let alone the children. What are we going to do?" The stepmother, with a mean look on her face, replied, "I know exactly what we should do." "What do you mean?" asked the woodcutter, curious but worried. "Tomorrow morning, I will take the children deep into the forest," the stepmother said with a cruel smile. "We'll leave them there, and then we won't have to worry about feeding them anymore. With just us, your money will be enough, and we'll be free from this hard life." "Leave them in the forest for the wolves?" the woodcutter gasped in horror. "How could you even think such a thing?" "Foolish man," she snapped. "If we don't, we'll all starve. We might as well prepare for our own end." The woodcutter didn't know what to say. He sat silently, torn between his love for his children and his fear of what might happen. Meanwhile, Hansel and Gretel were still awake, their empty tummies keeping them from sleep. They had heard everything, especially the part about being left for the wolves. Gretel was scared and began to cry. "What will happen to us, Hansel?" she sniffled. "Don't worry, Gretel," Hansel whispered, trying to comfort her. "I have a plan. Everything will be okay." Hansel and Gretel lay quietly in bed, waiting for the grown-ups to fall asleep. Once everything was still and silent, Hansel carefully got out of bed, put on his coat, and tiptoed outside, making sure not to wake anyone. The moon was shining brightly, lighting up the whole garden. Hansel looked around carefully, then spotted what he was searching for. He began picking up small, shiny white pebbles from the garden path and filled his pockets with them until they were completely full. Once he had enough, Hansel snuck back inside and quietly returned to bed. The next morning, there was a knock at their bedroom door. "Get up, you two," the stepmother called sharply. "You're coming with me into the forest to gather wood. Hurry up." Hansel and Gretel quickly got dressed. The stepmother handed Gretel a small piece of bread and said, "This is your lunch, and you have to share it. Don't eat it all at once, because there won't be any more." Gretel took the bread, and they followed their stepmother into the woods. As they walked, Hansel kept looking back over his shoulder, like he was searching for something. His stepmother noticed and asked, "Why do you keep looking behind us?" "I saw a cat," Hansel said, "and I'm checking to see if it's following us." "Stop being silly and hurry up," she snapped. But Hansel wasn't really looking for a cat. He was staying behind to drop the white pebbles he had gathered the night before, leaving a trail so they could find their way back home. They kept walking for a long time until they came to a small clearing in the forest. "Come, children," said the stepmother. "Gather some sticks, and I'll make us a fire. It's getting cold, and you need a little rest." Hansel and Gretel gathered up the sticks, and soon there was a warm, crackling fire. The stepmother said, "Sit here and rest by the fire. I'll come back with your father once we finish our work." And with that, she hurried off, leaving them alone. Hansel and Gretel sat by the fire, sharing the small piece of bread. It was a bit stale from being in Gretel's pocket, but they were so hungry they didn't mind. After eating, they grew sleepy and soon fell fast asleep by the cozy fire. Hours later, Gretel woke up with a start. "It's dark," she cried. "And there's no sign of our stepmother or father. Oh, Hansel, I'm so scared. What are we going to do?" "Don't worry, Gretel," Hansel said calmly. "I have a clever plan to get us home safely." Just then, the full moon rose high in the sky, shining brightly. "Look over there," said Hansel, pointing ahead. In the moonlight, the white pebbles Hansel had dropped on the ground began to sparkle and shine. "Wow," cried Gretel, "you left the pebbles to show us the way home. You're so clever, Hansel." Hansel smiled. Hand in hand, they followed the glowing pebbles all the way back, walking through the night. Just before dawn, they finally reached home. Their stepmother was shocked and furious to see them safe and sound. Her wicked plan had failed. But as time went on, things didn't get any better. In fact, just like their stepmother had feared, things got worse. The family became so poor that they only had half a loaf of bread left. "We must do something," the stepmother thought. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, she stayed up, plotting another mean plan. "I've got it," the stepmother said to herself. "This time, I'll take them even deeper into the forest, so far that they'll never find their way home. A wolf will eat them up, and then I can live in peace and have enough for myself." Once again, Hansel and Gretel were awake, their empty stomachs rumbling. They overheard everything. As before, Hansel waited until the house was quiet and crept toward the front door to collect more pebbles. But to his dismay, the door was locked. His heart sank as he returned to bed with no pebbles to guide them this time. Early the next morning, the stepmother stormed into their room. "Get up, you lazy little slugs," she shouted. She yanked them out of bed and hurried them to get dressed. Once they were ready, she handed each of them a small piece of bread, the last bits from their single remaining loaf. As they walked into the forest, Hansel put his bread in his pocket. Just like before, he quietly stayed behind and dropped crumbs along the path, hoping they would help him and Gretel find their way back. They walked deeper and deeper into the forest. As they walked, the path became narrower, and the trees grew thicker and taller. The forest was so dense that they could hardly see ahead. Hansel and Gretel had never been this deep into the woods before, and they were starting to feel very scared. Soon, they reached a small clearing. "Come, children," said their stepmother. "Gather some sticks, and I will make a fire. It's getting cold, and you need to rest." Hansel and Gretel did as they were told, and the stepmother built a fire. "Rest here, dear children," she said with a sly smile. "Eat your bread and lie down to sleep. I will return with your father when our work is done." Before they could answer, she was gone. They sat by the fire for a while, and then Gretel took out her bread and offered half to Hansel. "Here, brother, you have half. You used yours to leave a trail so we could find our way home." They ate the bread together by the warm, crackling fire and then fell asleep. Many hours passed, and soon it was dark, but no one came to get them. Suddenly, Gretel woke up. "It's so dark, Hansel," she said, her voice trembling. "And I'm scared." "Don't worry, dear sister," Hansel said kindly. "My trail of breadcrumbs will show us the way home. Let's wait for the moon to come out, and we'll be on our way." When the moon appeared and lit up the path, Hansel and Gretel looked around, but to their horror, there were no breadcrumbs. What they didn't know was that a little squirrel had been following them, nibbling up each crumb as soon as Hansel dropped it. "We're lost," cried Gretel. There, don't worry, dear sister," Hansel said, putting his arm around her. "I'm sure we'll find our way home, even without the crumbs." Hansel sounded brave, but inside he was just as scared as Gretel. Still, he kept his fears to himself to protect his sister. Together, they set off into the darkness, hoping to find their way. 2 nights and 2 days passed, and Hansel and Gretel still couldn't find their way out of the forest. They were tired, hungry, and completely lost, wandering deeper into the woods. Suddenly, Gretel's eyes lit up. I see something," she cried excitedly. "It's a house." Hansel said, surprised. With a burst of new energy, they ran towards the house as fast as they could. But as they got closer, Gretel squealed with joy. This wasn't an ordinary house, it was a house made entirely of gingerbread. The walls were covered in cakes, tarts, and candy, and every inch was decorated with sweet treats. "Let's stop here and have a feast," Hansel said with a mouth full of gingerbread, which he had already taken from the windowsill. Gretel smiled and nodded, too busy eating chunks of cake from the doormat to say a word. Just then, a voice whispered from behind the door. "Who is nibbling on my house?" the voice asked softly. Hansel quickly answered, "It's just the wind, the wind." But the door creaked open, and out hobbled an old woman. She looked very strange. Her skin had a greenish glow, her nose was long and crooked, and her face was covered in big, bumpy warts. Hansel and Gretel froze in fear. "Dear children," the old woman said, "come closer, for my eyes are not very good. You are far too young to be wandering in this dangerous forest all alone. Come inside and stay with me for a while." Before they knew it, the old woman grabbed them by their collars and brought them inside. She sat them at a large kitchen table filled with sandwiches, pancakes, crumpets, fruits, and nuts. "What are you waiting for?" she said kindly. "Eat up." And so they did, not knowing the danger that lay ahead. Once Hansel and Gretel had eaten until their tummies were full, the old woman showed them to a lovely room with 2 little beds. Each bed had soft, white curtains, and the pillows were so fluffy that Hansel and Gretel fell asleep the moment their heads touched them. But this was all part of a nasty trick. You see, the old woman wasn't really kind at all. In fact, she wasn't even a real lady. She was a wicked witch, the most evil witch in the whole forest. She had built her gingerbread house to lure children like Hansel and Gretel inside. And once she had them, she planned to fatten them up and then cook them for her supper. The very next morning, the wicked witch tiptoed into the children's room. She stood over them, sniffing the air. "Ah, yes," she muttered with a wicked grin, "this boy will make a delicious meal once he's fattened up." Her eyesight was poor, but the witch had a fantastic sense of smell. She could tell Hansel was a boy, and boys were her favorite because she thought they tasted extra meaty. Suddenly, she grabbed Hansel with her bony hands and dragged him outside to a small cage behind the house. Hansel screamed, but it was no use. The cage was made of thick iron bars and locked with a huge padlock. There was no way out. Then, the witch hurried back to Gretel's bedside and barked, "Wake up, you lazy girl. Go to the well and fetch me some water. I need to cook lots of delicious food for your brother to fatten him up." "Hansel, where are you?" cried Gretel, but the witch sneered and said, "He's locked up in a cage where you can't help him. Now, go get the water." From that day on, the witch gave Hansel big meals at every breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but poor Gretel had to work as the witch's servant, eating nothing but dry crusts and leftovers. Every morning, the witch would come to the cage and say, "Hansel, stick out your finger so I can see if you're fat enough to eat." But clever Hansel had a plan. He wasn't going to let the witch have her way so easily. Hansel knew the witch couldn't see well, so each time she asked him to stick out his finger, he used a little chicken bone instead. The witch felt the bone and thought Hansel was still too skinny, which made her very frustrated. Weeks went by, and the witch grew impatient. She was tired of waiting. "That's it," she shouted one day. "I will have my feast today. Gretel, fetch me a pail of water. I need enough to fill a pot to boil your brother." Gretel cried, her heart filled with fear. "There's no use crying, little girl," the witch sneered. "No one can hear you out here in the deep, dark woods." With no choice, Gretel brought the water. When she returned, the witch was busy kneading dough. "The oven is hot," the witch said. "We'll bake some bread while I wait for the water to boil." Creep inside the oven and see if it's hot enough. But clever Gretel knew exactly what the witch was trying to do. She wanted to push Gretel into the oven and bake her. So Gretel said, "I don't know how to open the oven door." The witch grumbled and opened it herself. "But I'm too big to fit through," Gretel said. To show her how, the witch stuck her head inside the oven door. And at that very moment, Gretel sprang into action. She gave the witch a mighty push, shoving her into the oven, and slammed the door shut, trapping the witch inside. "Gretel, let me out," the witch screamed. But it was too late. Gretel had outsmarted her. Gretel grabbed the keys and rushed to Hansel's cage. "Hansel, we're free. The witch is gone," she cried. Hansel leapt out, and they hugged each other tightly. "Let's get out of here," Hansel said. But Gretel stopped him. "Wait," she said. "I saw a chest in the witch's room filled with sparkling jewels." The two children filled their pockets with the shiny gems and then set off through the woods. They walked for many days, but finally, the trees began to thin, and the path became familiar. They were almost home. When they reached their cottage, their father burst into tears of joy. "My children! You've returned," he cried. "Look, father," Hansel said, as he poured glittering jewels onto the table. "We're rich now." Gretel looked around cautiously and asked, "But where's our stepmother?" Their father smiled and said, "She's gone, my dears, and she won't ever be coming back." From that day on, Hansel, Gretel, and their father lived happily together. And as the story goes, Hansel and Gretel never touched another piece of candy again. And so, their lives became full of joy and laughter. With the treasure they had brought home, they never had to worry about food or being poor again. Hansel and Gretel helped their father rebuild the cottage, and they planted a beautiful garden filled with flowers, fruits, and vegetables. Every day was a new adventure, but this time they faced it together as a family, without any fear. The children never forgot their time in the witch's house, but instead of being scared, they were proud of how brave and clever they had been. And whenever they told the story, they always reminded others that kindness and courage could outsmart even the most wicked of foes. From that day on, the family lived peacefully and happily, always taking care of each other. And as for Hansel and Gretel, they made a promise to never wander too far into the woods again, but if they did, they knew they would face anything as long as they were together. And so, they lived happily ever after. The end.